second scripture is from the prophet Isaiah chapter 7, verses 10 to 16. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, saying, "Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven." But Ahaz said, "I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test." Then Isaiah said, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary mortals that you must also weary my God? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose two kings you are in dread will be deserted." There was once a very religious man who, at the deepest parts of his heart, wanted to know that God was with him. He wanted to have incontrovertible proof that God was there. And he whispered in prayer, "God, let me hear your voice." A meadowlark sang. He didn't notice. He shouted to God, "Let me hear your voice," and the thunder rolled. The man walked away, frustrated that God had not answered. Later he prayed, "Let me see a miracle." A baby was born. He took no notice. Finally, he begged in despair, "If you are really there, God, let me feel your touch." He brushed the butterfly away and left. We have a whole bunch of those kinds of stories in our culture, don't we? Some are jokes. There's the story of the person who fell off the cliff and was hanging from the branch, shouting in dear life, "Will someone up there help me?" And God answers, "Let go." "Is there anybody else up there?" Or the person in the flood sitting on the roof of their house praying, "God, please deliver me." And the helicopter comes, and the person brushes it away, saying, "God will deliver me," and prays again, "God, please deliver me," as the water's rising and rising. And then the boat comes, and the person says, "No, go away, I have faith that God will deliver me." And as the water goes up to the person's mouth, and they look up and say, "God, why aren't you delivering me?" And God says, "Who do you think sent the helicopter and the boat?" As a culture, we like signs, and we like them to be big. We don't go in for subtlety too much. And if we have one place in our culture that proves that subtlety takes a second place, all you have to do is drive down the strip in Las Vegas, right? Subtlety is not a characteristic there. But of course, that is only a symptom of the deeper characteristic. Every place obviously doesn't look like that, but we still like incontrovertible proof. We want to be able to point at something and say, there is no way you can argue with that at all, at all. Well, as I said with Corwin and Alara, that December is filled with signs that Christmas is coming. And they get all five of our senses, don't they? The lights twinkle and blink. We have a neighbor that's like one of those commercials that you see, that I'm sure they can see this guy's house from outer space. It really is amazing. And every year it gets bigger and wilder and more. And we were driving by the other night, and it was blinking, and I was thinking, oh man, if someone had epilepsy, that would just cause a seizure for sure. It was astounding. It was astounding. The decorations, even when they're not that over the top, they shimmer and they glisten, and we cannot but see them. Stores are jammed with shoppers, parking lots with cars. Streets are crowded with people carrying packages and bags. If you turn on the television, the toy commercials flash on the screen every 10 minutes, enticing children to add to their lists. And if it's not ads for toys, it's ads for jewelry or cars, so that you can show the one whom you love that you really do. And what shows love better than a brand new Jaguar? And isn't it better to buy one for someone else than for yourself? Okay. We hear the strains of Christmas songs on the radio, and as the backdrop in every store. There's a radio station that we get in the valley based out of Lompoc that they advertise that starting on Thanksgiving Day, they play nothing but Christmas music. And they use that term too. They don't say holiday music, they say Christmas music. And they do. Oh, do they? As you can guess, it's not my favorite station this time of year. If you walk in the right places, you'll pass a Salvation Army bucket and a person dressed as Santa ringing a bell. If you're really lucky, you might even have carolers who will come to your door, knock on your door, and sing songs. Some of us went last week and sang along to Messiah. And that familiar ho, ho, ho rings in all of our ears this time of year, doesn't it? Then there are the smells. Cinnamon, cloves, spices, cookies being baked. Is there any smell better than that? I'd be hard-pressed to find one. And the tastes when those cookies get done. And not just cookies, other Christmas foods and drinks that happen pretty much only at this time of year. And then there are the tactile things, the feeling of that gooey cookie dough. There's just something about Christmas, and that does it. I've talked many times about my family making Christmas cookies and how crazy that was. But for all of us, it's a time when if you ever bake cookies, this is when you do it. And that feeling, the prick of pine needles. It's Christmas. The sticky sap of a Christmas tree. There's something about that, isn't there? Oh, and I forgot the smell of pine. The signs of Christmas are everywhere, and they are of all of those sorts. And they are not subtle for the most part. They are not subtle for the most part. And we like having signs that are not subtle. Ahaz was given the opportunity to ask for a sign and told it can be anything. Anything from Sheol, the depths of hell, all the way to heaven. You can ask of God any sign you want for God to show that indeed God is with you. That first guy in my sermon would have been very happy with that opportunity. God, let me hear your voice. And God says, okay, this is me. Could ask for anything. Could ask for anything. And yet, Ahaz refuses. He refuses. Now, we need to understand what's going on behind the scenes here to understand why he refused, why he feigns piety and says, no, I'm not going to tempt God by asking for a sign. The people, as people are wont to do, had fallen away from their calling, had turned their backs on God, the God who had led them out of Egypt, the God who gave them identity as a people. They had stopped being what they were supposed to be. And the enemy was threatening on the border. Things looked very, very bad. And here's Ahaz, king of the nation, who is responsible for its very life, for its future. He's got to make the right choice as he faces what's coming. And he's beset with advice from all sides. He's got trusted advisors who know what they're talking about, and they're giving him advice. He's got other folk who are really worried because they see the enemy coming and they are afraid of what might happen, and they have advice. Then there are those folk who are really, really well-meaning, but they just don't have the proper information, but they still have opinions. They've read something on the internet. And so they want to give their opinions. Then there's that group of people who want to give their advice, and they're really not concerned about the big picture. They're only worried about their own private interests, but they still have advice. Ahaz, you've got to do this or I might lose my business. There are those who had advice to give and who were simply wrong, because they looked at the situation and they had an ideological bias that did not allow them to consider what they were looking at from a realistic point of view. And so they gave advice that was wrong, simply wrong. And then, of course, there's always that group of folk who want to give advice who are just crazy. And they've got lots of advice. All of these folk were trying to get the king's ear. All of these folk had solutions for the problems that were facing them, and Ahaz was responsible to make a decision. He was confused. He heard all of this coming his way. He was worried about what might happen. If he made the right decision, things could be great. If he made the wrong decision, well, things would not. And he had his own biases and his own hopes. Not the least of which was, if the enemy came into the city, he was dead. And his whole family was dead. He wanted to preserve his own life and his own power. And so in the midst of all of this, he makes his decision. He makes a decision to open the door and allow the enemy in. He says to himself, being a vassal state is much better than being dead. At least there are some possibilities in the future, some options. If we try to fight, we're dead, so I'm just going to bend over and let them in. Now, Isaiah, the prophet, had been one of those people trying to get the king's ear. And he was not one of the king's favorite people. Because all along, he had been condemning the king, condemning the society for not being what it was supposed to be. And he had been proposing radical changes for the society. He wanted to see a nation that was more just. He wanted to see the people who were on the margins cared for. He wanted to see things leveled out. He wanted to see God's yearnings for all of God's people filled full. And all of that didn't sound so good to Ahaz and his friends who were in power. And so Ahaz didn't like him. And in the midst of all of this, Isaiah says, Ahaz, trust in God. Do what I'm proposing. Trust in God, and you don't have to worry about the Assyrians. God will take care of that. Because God is with us. Trust in God. Now, again, Isaiah was not Ahaz's most trusted advisor. Indeed, he was not on the list at all. And so Isaiah says, okay, now listen. Ask a sign from God. God will give you any sign you want to prove that indeed I am telling you the truth. To prove that indeed God is with us, and if we just do what God wants, everything will be okay. And Ahaz refuses with his feigned piety. He has made up his mind, and he doesn't want to be confused by facts. He doesn't want to hear any proof. He's done. And so he says, nah, I don't tempt God. And Isaiah says, okay, Sign is chosen then. You don't want one? Well, you're going to get one anyway. Devastation will come. Only a remnant will be saved, but in the midst of that, God will be at work. Something very ordinary will happen. Something very ordinary that is perhaps that most profound sign of hope for the future. A young woman will give birth. Happens every single day. And every single time it happens, it is always a sign of hope. Every child born, any child born, is a reminder of God's promise, of God's presence, and God's possibilities for the future. But this child, by the time this child is old enough to make choices between good and evil, the enemy will be gone. There's that funny little thing in there, by the time the child eats curds and honey. What in the world is that about? Well, that's because they were under siege, and there were no curds or honey. There was no food at all. So the fact that the child eats means the enemies are gone. God will take care of it. But all of these are signs that are only obvious when you look backwards. They don't help you make better decisions. Well, yeah, the enemy will be gone then, but how will I know what to do to make that happen? Now, I should say, put a little parenthesis in here, there is an issue with the text, and it's an important one for us. You might have noticed that the passage I read from the Old Testament said a young woman will be with child, and the passage that Nancy read said a virgin will conceive. And the reality is that in the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, the word that gets translated there for young woman has nothing at all to do with sexual experience. It's just literally a young woman. That's what the Hebrew says. But there was also a Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was the translation that was most used at the time of Jesus, called the Septuagint. And the Greek word that's used there literally translates as virgin, young woman who has had no sexual intercourse. So when the gospel writers read this passage, they're reading it in the Greek, not the Hebrew. The translators, when they translate it, they have to decide, are we translating from the Hebrew or from the Greek? And if you look at your Bible, some of them will have one, some will have the other. Do with that what you want. In any case, it's not the kind of sign that Ahaz wanted or needed. But then again, he had refused to ask for one that would have been more helpful. Signs. The early church looked for signs. Here they were trying to figure out how to be the people of God, how to be followers of Jesus, and they needed signs to tell them, yeah, God is still with us. And they looked back at this passage. They wanted a miraculous sign, but they saw just this word in the Greek, that a virgin would conceive and bear a son, God with us. Certainly, they said, this refers to Jesus, the Messiah. They didn't really seem to notice that, as far as signs go, it's not a very good one. Because, indeed, who would know whether Mary was a virgin or not, except Mary, and presumably the angel. Even Joseph didn't know, and it takes a visit from an angel for him not to quietly and gently put Mary away. This birth of Jesus is not a very good indicator that God is with anybody. He's just one more poor baby with brown skin, born in this obscure corner of the world. But of course, there is another way to look at it, isn't there? There is the way to look at it that says God is at work. God is there in the everyday, quietly, always there, even in the most ordinary looking of circumstances. This did seem to be a very ordinary occurrence. Nothing unusual really happens with the baby being born, a poor baby, and stuck in a manger because there is no better place to be. It took eyes of faith to see that anything special had happened. And it was that faith that assured them indeed God was with them that day, tomorrow, next year, the years to come, the decades, and even the centuries yet to come. Feels to me like it's an important statement for us today. Say, God is with us. God is with us. Now, I want to say, I don't believe things are worse now than they have ever been. We hear people saying that. Things are so bad, they're worse than they've ever been. Don't believe it. We've had economies that were marked by inequality that were more unequal than they are now. We've had that. We had a time when racism was literally one of the founding characteristics of our nation. Literally. We've been politically more divided than we are now. Heck, we had a civil war that was a real war. And in the 60s, the cities were on fire. We've had times when our political process was more uncivil than it is now. There were times in the early years of this nation when politicians went outside and had a duel after arguing in the House or Senate. Things have been much worse. On a personal level, we were struck by it this week, the realization that certainly 100 years ago, and likely much less than that, our granddaughter would have died. But as it was, she went to the doctor, they gave her 2 shots, sent her home, and she's here this morning. Things have been worse. Things have been worse. In the midst of Alara's infection, I've been listening to this book that I mentioned last week, and they gave an illustration of how bad things were. They talked about King Edward, and I think it was Queen Margaret was his wife. Had 16 children, 10 died in childhood, 6 made it past their teen years, but only 3 made it into their 40s. And in the middle of that, my granddaughter has 105 fever. Yeah. Things have been worse. Now, that's not to say that we don't have serious issues that we're facing. We do. We are divided as a people. We have not adequately addressed the sin of racism or any of the other isms that beset us. The economy is working great for some people while others are left behind. Even those assaults on our bodies, those illnesses, there's a lot of work to be done. But we're in Advent, where we are reminded that this is the season of not yet, but still yet to come. A time when we are reminded that God is with us, and God is at work, and things are moving forward if we just open our eyes. Now, most of the time, almost all of the time, God works quietly in ordinary ways that are easy to miss even with eyes of faith. Even with eyes of faith. Sometimes we have to look really hard to see that God is there. When that butterfly lands on your shoulder, you have to think twice before you brush it off and look, oh, that was the touch of God. As we listen to the rain falling, some of us think, rain is falling. God is with us. Other of us are thinking, oh man, I left my umbrella in the car. And still others are afraid, what happens if in the burn scar areas there's enough rain that something starts to slide? But we are called to listen for the meadowlark, to look at the new babies, to feel the butterflies lighting on our shoulders, because in those ordinary moments, God is there. The not yet of Advent always points its way to the child born in a manger, who fills full all of God's yearnings. Because the child will be born, salvation does come, grace is poured out, new possibilities do take shape. We just need to open our eyes and our hearts to see them. God is with us.